I'm Betty Jane Edna Watts Carrington. I graduated from the University of Michigan School of Nursing in 1958. At that time, I was the only person of color in my class of over 250 when we began and about 130 when we graduated. Immediately after that, I was already engaged. The plan was for me, I was getting married, and I got married that August, and everything centered on that and moving to New York with my husband. I didn't really plan at that time to work full time. My dream was to settle in, get to know the city, get to know my way around, and then perhaps I would work. At that time, women were not really working, were not perceived to be working as steadily and as really being depended upon to contribute to the family. However, the reality was in New York City, with the expenses of the time, shortly after I moved in, I did decide that I needed to use that BSN degree, and it would benefit me also with experience. And so, with family support, I did get my first job at Booth Memorial Hospital right there in Queens, New York. I worked there on med-surg, the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift, for about a year. And leaving that position, I joined the New York City Department of Health as a public health nurse, because in my senior year at Michigan, I had elected to do the public health rotation, which was 3 months on the west side of Detroit, Michigan. And so I wanted to get back into public health. I worked as a school nurse until I realized I was pregnant. In those days, once you were pregnant, you weren't allowed to continue working, especially once you began to show around 3 months gestation. And so I stopped work, had a complicated pregnancy, and delivered my oldest child, my son, vaginally with a physician, a high forceps delivery. My son is fine, but he was a low birth weight baby. And so these were things that settled in my mind. I had had such a wonderful positive experience at Michigan with rooming in, with spinal and caudal anesthesia, with mothers involved more with their babies. And in New York, that was not the case. And then my own experience of low birth weight, and I did breastfeed my son, and he really caught up quickly, so that at the 6-week exam, he had already gained he was up to 8 pounds. I wanted to know why the low birth weight. I wanted to know why did I need a high forceps? And those were questions that settled in my mind. In the meantime, I was raising my children, my son, and I knew we were looking forward to another baby, and so working part-time, doing private duty only when I needed to. That was my life until 1966. By that time, the second child was 2 years old. That was my daughter. Her birth was it was spontaneous. It was much more normal. However, I realized that my postpartum sequences were very stressful. I developed bleeding ulcers during the postpartum, so I wondered about that. So with my own personal history going forward, I began to work in the health department again and quickly settled in to work in the child health clinics, as well as doing public health visits on new mothers and working in the schools. So I had quite a lot of experience as school nurse, home visiting with new mothers, and also working in the child health clinics, which New York sponsored at the time. The Department of Health had free child health clinics, and women would come in with their newborn to 5-year-old children, and the children would be examined, would be watched for their developmental goals, how they were developing, Mothers were advised on feeding and growth and development, and immunizations were given according to schedule. By 1968, they wanted to start a program where nurses would do the history taking, find out if there were any problems with the children, and then give the immunizations according to the standing rules with a pediatrician in the room next door. So I initiated that program there. I was one of 3 in the city of New York to do that. I felt that that was the beginning of my desire to really want to help women. I wanted them to know more about their babies, more about their histories, their health histories, their maternal child health experiences. There were gaps in knowledge, and I wanted to be able to help women, empower women. I felt women needed a lot more information than they were showing to me. And so with that in mind and with my own experiences, I was looking for a graduate program in maternal health, maternal child. At that time, Med-Surg and Psych were the graduate programs in nursing which were the most popular. And I looked, and I did not really feel drawn to either of the programs, any of the programs that I was aware of. And in January of 1970, I received an RN magazine, and a nurse midwife from Kings County Hospital was on the cover, garbed in the delivery room scrub, and she had just helped a mother birth her baby. And when I saw the cover of that RN magazine, I was ecstatic. I said, this is what I've been looking for. This is what I want. I want to go to school. I was very fortunate because my husband was very supportive. My husband, Homer, helped me plan about returning to school. I had been out of school for 12 years, so it was going to be quite a big undertaking for us. We had 2 children, 9 and 4 at the time, and so it was going to be quite something that we had to consider. And also I knew that I could only go to school once. I could not duplicate anything, and so I decided to apply to Columbia, and that was the only program I applied to for midwifery. And I was accepted under condition that I show some hospital experience. So the obstacle I had was that I had to try to get that experience, which I did. I went back to the Booth Memorial Hospital and volunteered to be a nurse there for 3 months in labor and delivery so that I could prove that I could get experience. However, that labor and delivery experience was far different from Michigan's because their heavy analgesia, plenty of anesthesia was used, and when the women labored, they were completely out, and the only way we knew that they were ready to give birth was when their brow became furrowed. They were definitely not awake and aware. But anyway, I was able to matriculate with my family's support, and I was successful in completing the program. And I had overcome the obstacle of commuting, because in my midwifery class, out of the 13, only 3 of us were married and only 2 of us had children. Everyone else was quite young and free. And I had to commute between 168th Street and Broadway to Jamaica, Queens on public transportation. And then I had 2 children with homework and other things to, prepare for. So it was a very difficult year for me. But I did complete it. Not as well as I would have liked. I didn't feel that I had been as scholarly as I would have liked. In the meantime, I then began to look for a job after I attended that first A.C.N.M convention where there were only 100 attendees. And I met Miss Dorothea Lang, and so everybody was approaching her for jobs because at the time New York City was the only place where it was legal to practice nurse midwifery at that time. I did approach her, and she took a chance on me. And I did pass my certification exam because 1971 was the first year that A.C.N.M had the certification exam, and I was able to pass it. But I still wasn't quite pleased with where I was in my own head with the learning. But nevertheless, the experience that the MIC program provided, because we were able to go to different hospitals and work with several different senior midwives, that was wonderful experience. And the other thing that helped, even though it was an obstacle in terms of gender and race, happened to be the issue of me saying to the staff at Brookdale Hospital, where I was doing intrapartum and postpartum care, that I was a nurse midwife. When there were midwives there from abroad who said, "Oh, you can't possibly be a midwife. There are no midwives here in the United States." And also the doctors felt that we were only able to put our hands on clinic patients. And those were our clientele. And that was fine for me because these were the women that I really wanted to work with. So what happened when I first was assigned to Brookdale, I could not, the doctors were reluctant to give me anything to do. But I would scrub up, and I would put my scrubs on, and I would sit outside our little office, and I would reread all my textbooks. And so each time they didn't give me anything to do, I would be there, but I would read and I would study. And because it was an uncomfortable environment at the time, I was able to focus on what I was reading. And I really felt that that made all the difference in my learning, that I felt so much more secure after that. So even though it was a bad thing in a way and an obstacle, it actually helped me tremendously. And when the doctors did eventually call on me and started giving me assignments and patients to care for, they were pleased with my performance. And I soon became the director of the midwifery unit, the midwives there. And I stayed there from 1971 until 1979. And the next phase of my midwifery was to go into education. Miss Lorette Beck at Downstate, SUNY, the State University of New York, Downstate, needed teachers. And I also wanted to learn the new modular way of teaching midwifery. It was a much more structured curriculum than we had had 11, 12 years before. And so I wanted to be a part of that. And so with mixed feelings, I left Brookdale Hospital, where it was a wonderful, wonderful experience. I really learned a lot, was able to do a lot ahead of what we were able to do at the time, and went into education, which was quite a different culture and was a new learning curve for me altogether. I stayed at Downstate from 1979 to 1986, and from 1984 to 86 I was in the Teachers College Education Administration doctoral program, and I finished that program. Once I finished that, I went to Columbia, and I directed the program there for 5 years, and I had my clinical position at Harlem Hospital. So altogether, I had been in so many hospitals, different experience, that it was a very, very rich background. As I finished at Columbia, I was doing well, but there were terrific challenges there. One must remember that the Columbia Master's Program is the oldest one in the country. And here I am as a person of color, taking the directorship there. As I look back on it and experienced it, I wasn't totally welcomed, but I persisted in being there. The students were wonderful, and I was able to fit into that setting because of the privileges I had had coming from the University of Michigan and whatnot. And I was able to hold my own there with the help of midwives from the New York City area and from Miss Lang and all of the others who assisted me with precepting and helping me to get adequate faculty to support the program. However, my husband became terminally ill, and when he did, I then knew that I could not continue there full time, and I then resigned that job, had a wonderful retirement party that was given to me, but I did continue at Harlem Hospital part-time, working in the adolescent clinic and in the prenatal clinic for substance abusing women. And so I stayed there until 1997. What I have not mentioned is that I have been active in the American College of Nurse Midwives on a volunteer level throughout my career. I served as National Vice President under Dr. Elizabeth Sharp. I served as the regional representative when the bylaws were first redesigned, and that was in the early 70s. So I was regional rep for the New York area. And then I continued on different committees and divisions, particularly, and my favorite has been the Division of Accreditation, where I started as site visitor. From site visitor, I then was asked to serve on the Board of Review, which I did for several years. And from the Board of Review, I was asked to serve on the governing board. And on the governing board, I was then asked to direct the Division of Accreditation. That I loved to do. It was wonderful working with everyone who was in that division. It was a particularly gratifying experience, and we did so much. During that 5-year period when I was in that directorship position, we had to write the petition to the Federal Department of Education. Then we had to defend that petition to allow us and to enable us as A.C.N.M to continue to be a specialty accrediting agency. And we did win the right to continue as specialty accrediting agency. And I was able to complete the full 5-year term. And at that point, I resigned and retired, or in my own mind, retired. So while I finished clinical practice in 1997, I actually retired from really a very responsible volunteer position in 2004. In 1971, there were several revolutions in society that were going on at the same time. We were at the end of the civil rights movement and many of the legislative pieces that had been passed, but we were also into the women's revolution, the sexual revolution, and just so many rapidly changing social factors. Myself and others really became more activists. Instead of being the passive housewife, the mother at home, we began to feel like we could accomplish almost anything. And so when I got into the midwifery education program, I realized I had to be more assertive because there were no cell phones in those days. You had to solve your own problems. You had to figure things out without being able to call 3 and 4 people. But in addition to that, it was a time of black power, of all kinds of power. Older women were returning to school. There were so many possibilities, and we saw it as that. However, some things had not changed. And after I became certified and went to convention and really heard the stories of the few other midwives of color who would come, we found out that there was a lot of pain and isolation and just hurt feelings that many of the student midwives were experiencing. And I was pleased to have been a part of the 1972 International Confederation of Midwives. And that was the first gathering of midwives of color from the United States, which included some midwives who had been trained abroad. What we found out is that we needed to support one another. And many of the nurses who were in midwifery programs in the United States felt so isolated, as they were either one or two people per class. Their educational preparation had not really prepared them for the rigors of midwifery. And so we then came together and said we would mentor those students. Those who were in the New York area would come to Jamaica, Queens, to my local church, and we would have tutoring sessions. Or we would tutor whenever it was convenient and possible, and whenever there was a gathering. So for several years, we would go to the annual conventions of A.C.N.M, and we would pass the word along. We're meeting in room 376 this evening at 7. Why don't you come? And that's what we did secretly, because we did not feel comfortable enough to even think that we could have a room assigned to the informal group of midwives of color that we happened to be at the time. So there was no structure at the beginning, but we formed a support group for several years before moving to the next phase, which others in the legacy will describe as we go along. Now, since 2004, I have been more active in the community. I decided that with the knowledge and skills I had gained through midwifery, I needed to be able to help improve life in the community. And so for quite a few years, I was on the auxiliary of the Queens Hospital Center, which is a part of the Health and Human Services, HHC of New York City. I served on the auxiliary as a recording secretary. And then I became aware of a need to serve on the board of the Alpha Phi Alpha Senior Citizen Center, which needed to have some restructuring. I served on that board for about 7 years, and it is now functioning very well with an emphasis on health and wellness. There was another need that came to my attention, and I was recruited to be a volunteer with the Queens Sickle Cell Advocacy Network, Incorporated, a grassroots not-for-profit organization which serves as a referral and information service for individuals and families suffering with sickle cell disorders. I learned so much about sickle cell anemia, knowing that as a midwife I had not ever cared for a woman with sickle cell because of the complication that is inherent with that history. What I learned, and really it just opened my eyes, is that there's so many young adults living with sickle cell, and how that has affected their lives and has kept them from having fulfilling lives for the most part. Yes, some become lawyers, doctors, finish their college education, but most are chronically ill, spend weeks and months in hospital, and still have a lifespan, generally 42 at age 42 for men and 48 for women. And so I have become very involved with the sickle cell community, and the Queens Sickle Cell Advocacy Network, Inc. is the New York chapter of the Sickle Cell Disease Association of America. And I have been privileged to work with them on a volunteer basis. One of the things that I did to try to change or improve the numbers of midwives of color within the college was to ask to be invited to schools of midwifery so that we could talk about cultural competency. cultural competency and cultural awareness, because I felt that programs really needed to understand more about the culture in order to recruit and help midwives of color to be successful in completing the program. And so therefore I was consultant with several schools. I went to Boston University, University of Pennsylvania, Florida, University of Florida. So I have spoken and written and actually, conducted sessions on cultural competency and how to get students, potential students, to prepare for entering graduate work with the rigor of midwifery as the curriculum. And one of the things I really introduced to many of the programs was to have an open house for prospective students or interested students, because I found midwives of color really benefited a lot if they understood what was entailed and could ask questions in person about the curriculum, the hours, the expense, the demands of the program. And that I found helped when I was working as an educator. I got to know more about the personal social needs of the students and the fact that you have to reach out, have to go to them. You can't always wait for the students to come to you and ask for help. You have to encourage them to work together, to seek help, not to be ashamed if they feel they're having difficulty and having some struggling. And I found, students were always successful if all of these things were taken into account. If they really knew what to expect and were able to prepare themselves, their success was a lot more guaranteed. So I found education to be very gratifying. I'm happy to see how many more people, students of color or graduates of color, are in the college now, because I went to the Long Beach Convention a couple years ago, and I was able to attend the Midwives of Color reception. And I was so pleased to see this large room full of students and graduates of color at the convention and having such a wonderful time. And it just made me feel just quite good. Yeah, just to see them. I mean, they were doing the waddle, And this big room, we used to be able to have a reception in a room just about this size. And now they're in a room that must accommodate at least 150 people now, which is a good turnout for a convention. Women now are more empowered simply because of all the factors and the forces that have come together. And yet, economically and politically, we have to be aware that it's a fragile gain, because it can go back at any time. And I am concerned that women now are not feeling quite as empowered. And this is women as a whole. This is my observation, that as they were even 10 years ago. I'm not quite sure. I think political issues are affecting economic issues and social issues now. And so to me, it's not just the women alone. We have to look at political and economic issues and how they impact the social fabric of our nation. It's worthwhile study, but my ultimate goal is to see midwifery become an integral part of the healthcare system. Every woman should have the option of having midwifery care. And short of that, we haven't made it. And so I'm looking to a healthcare system which probably will generate as much controversy as the Affordable Care Plan. But I feel very hopeful that because of what the Affordable Care Act has done to open up discussion about healthcare options, that midwifery will somehow move in when if we move to more of a universal healthcare insurance plan. We definitely have to give women their choice. We have to acknowledge that women can have power over their bodies. And I don't know why it's such a political thing to fuss for men to be trying to decide how women's bodies should be cared for. My only regret really is that I wish I could have worked longer. I wish I could have had the opportunity to be in a more comfortable work environment, because I had always worked in public hospitals and in public clinics. And public clinics, you have little help, and you're working. I had to run down the hall to get all my lab reports run back. And I can remember having to see 16 patients in 2.5 hours. That was not an ideal type of arrangement. So that's the final position I had. But if I could have continued, working, I think I wasn't quite ready when I stopped clinically. And I do believe that there's a place for retired midwives. I would actually like to see midwives who are retired from all the full scope practice work in the schools. We need midwives in the middle schools and high schools to counsel each and every student about their reproductive responsibilities, their risks and the rights, all of that. I remember studying different countries and how midwives worked. And I remember some years ago, this was the focus of midwives in New Zealand, that they spoke to each individual student. I believe it was on the middle school level, and counseled them about puberty and all the changes and how they could cope with all those changes. And there's so much that midwives can offer, and it doesn't have to be confined to full scope care, nor does it have to be confined to clinical care. And so we have to find a way to use midwives who can continue to work until they're 80 if they wish. And I would like to see that come to pass. I think there's a lot more we could do. Well, the heart of midwifery is the heart of the midwife. I believe midwives, I really love what they do. They love caring for women. To me, that's what the heart of it is. Not the skill. It's nice to have the skill. We enjoy our skills. We're proud of our skills and our clinical acumen. We're a profession that really has a caring heart for each and every person we care for. And you don't see that in many professions, but I believe that we connect with each individual we care for. And that's what we carry over into society as we work in the community. Well, moving forward, I'm very active still with sickle cell community, but I feel the need to slow down. Not only am I active there, but I'm active in my national sorority, Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority. I'm active in National Association of University Women, which focuses on education. And I find by being active, my health has been able to, it's been sustained. And I enjoy activity, I enjoy being with people, and I feel that that is helpful for anyone as they age. Continue to contribute, continue to be involved with people in a meaningful way. So that's what I plan to do, but slow down. I have grandchildren that are now 17 and 20, There's no very, very young children in our family right now. I've already traveled quite a bit, so I have, you know, I'm pretty content. I was born at home in West Virginia. I'm the oldest of three children. I was born to my father, James Henry Watts, my mother, Odessa Esmeralda Watts. Born at home, they always thought I was very alert, and I always felt pushed academically. And what happened with my sister and my brother, we had migrated in the Great Migration. We had moved from West Virginia to Southern Ohio. And my parents wanted to do what was new, what was current, what was the thing to do. So my sister and my brother were both born in hospital. And the effect, I must say, my sister did not speak well until she was 5. And I feel that it was because my mother was over medicated. My brother was in the breech position, and I realized later that my mother had been x-rayed in labor to confirm the breech position, and my brother died of a glioblastoma, a brain tumor, at the age of 14. And so all of these things contributed to my desire to know about, to know why, to know what was happening.